The world stopped turning the moment the sky over Jerusalem tore open and swallowed the darkness whole. Rachel Myers hadn't slept in 37 hours, her mind churning with deadlines and the weight of stories no one seemed to care about anymore when the light came. Not gradually like dawn, but all at once, as if someone had struck a match. Against the fabric of heaven itself. She stood on the roof of her hotel, coffee growing cold in her trembling hand, watching the ancient city breathe in the pre-dawn stillness, when every shadow suddenly fled. The dome of the rock, that golden crown atop the Temple Mount, became the epicenter of something her journalist's mind had no framework to contain. Light poured down from above, in a column so brilliant it turned night into noon, so pure it seemed to have texture, weight, substance, as if holiness itself had taken physical form and chosen this exact moment, this exact place, to break through the veil. The sound that accompanied it wasn't sound at all, but a frequency that bypassed her ears entirely and resonated in her chest, her bones, the deepest chambers of her heart, where grief and longing lived. Around her, across rooftops and streets and holy places, thousands of people stopped mid-step, mid-breath, mid-prayer. A Muslim woman frozen with her forehead pressed to her prayer rug, a Jewish man with his hand still raised. Toward the western wall, a Christian pilgrim with tears suspended on her cheeks like diamonds, all of them caught in the same impossible moment. Rachel's notebook slipped from her fingers and tumbled over the edge of the roof, pages fluttering like frightened birds, but she couldn't move to catch it. Her body had forgotten how to obey her, every muscle locked in place by something far greater than fear. The silence that followed was more profound than any she had ever known. A silence that seemed to exist before language, before thought, before the first human ever learned to cry out in wonder or terror. The light began to gather itself, to concentrate and condense, pulling inward from its blinding dispersal until it took shape above the ancient stones where prophets had walked and empires had fallen. What emerged from that radiance defied every category her Western education had given her. Not angel, not ghost, not hallucination, but utterly, terrifyingly real. The being stood 20 feet tall, though stood seemed inadequate for something that appeared to exist slightly outside the normal flow of space, its form simultaneously solid and translucent, as if woven from starlight and memory. Its face held features both alien and achingly familiar, as though every human who had ever lived had contributed something to its countenance, making it somehow the face of a stranger, and the face of home all at once. Robes that might have been fabric or might have been flowing energy cascaded down its form, shot through with colors Rachel had no names for, hues that existed in spectrums her eyes shouldn't have been able to perceive. Wings. No, not wings, something like wings, but made of light itself, unfurled behind it, each feather a constellation, each movement leaving trails of luminescence that hung in the air like brushstrokes of the divine. When it opened its mouth to speak, Rachel heard English, but the woman beside her would later swear she heard Arabic, and the man below heard Hebrew, and somehow they were all hearing the exact same words in the exact same moment. The voice carried such authority that the very stones of Jerusalem seemed to bow, such gentleness that Rachel felt her cynicism crack like an eggshell, revealing something vulnerable and newborn underneath. "I have been with you since the beginning," it said, and the words rippled outward in concentric circles of meaning, each syllable containing volumes of truth her mind struggled to unpack. "I have watched you build and destroy, love and hate, remember and forget." The being's eyes, ancient beyond measure, holding the weight of eons, swept across the frozen multitude with an expression of such profound sadness and joy mingled together that Rachel felt something in her chest break open. Her knees buckled, and suddenly she could move again, but only to fall, her palms scraping against the rough concrete of the rooftop as tears she hadn't cried in years came flooding out. Around her, across the holy city, thousands were experiencing the same collapse, the same surrender, as if the sheer presence of this being had dismantled every wall they had built around their hearts. Rachel had spent a decade reporting from war zones, had interviewed terrorists and politicians and victims of unspeakable cruelty, had learned to keep her emotions locked behind professional distance. But none of that mattered now. This was bigger than her skepticism, bigger than her career, bigger than every carefully constructed belief system she had used to make sense of a senseless world. The being's gaze found hers across the distance, and in that instant of connection, she knew with absolute certainty that she was seen, not just observed, but truly seen, every secret thought and hidden shame and buried hope laid bare before an intelligence that somehow still loved her anyway. "You have asked if you are alone," the being continued, its voice now soft as a lullaby, strong as a mountain. "You have cried out in your darkness, wondering if anyone hears, if anyone cares, if the universe is cold and empty or alive with purpose." A pause, pregnant with meaning as the first rays of natural dawn began to touch the eastern horizon. "I am here to tell you that you have never, not for one moment, been abandoned." The air itself seemed to shimmer with the weight of that declaration, and Rachel felt something shift in the core of her being, some fundamental recalibration of her understanding of reality. She had come to Jerusalem chasing a story about rising tensions and ancient conflicts, armed with her laptop and her cynicism and her carefully maintained neutrality. But neutrality was impossible now. Objectivity, a luxury she could no longer afford, because something in the presence of this being called to a part of her she had forgotten existed. The part that used to pray as a child, the part that had once believed in miracles before the world taught her otherwise. Around her, she heard the sounds of others waking from their paralysis, gasps and sobs, prayers in a dozen languages, the clatter of dropped cameras and cell phones as people reached for each other instead of their devices. An elderly rabbi near the western wall had collapsed forward, his body shaking with sobs that sounded like release, like a dam breaking after years of holding back floods. A young Palestinian mother clutched her children, whispering words Rachel couldn't hear but could feel the meaning of: protection, wonder, fear, transformed into fierce maternal love. And still, the being stood above them all, patient as eternity, its presence alone rewriting every certainty they had carried into this moment. Rachel realized her hands were pressed together in prayer position, though she hadn't consciously chosen to move them there, and she found she didn't want to pull them apart. Not yet, not until she understood what was happening, or at least began to glimpse the edges of a truth she suspected might be too vast for her small human heart to hold all at once. The being's form shifted, becoming somehow more present, more intimate, as if drawing closer to them without moving at all. And when it spoke again, its voice carried a tremor of emotion that made Rachel's breath catch. This cosmic intelligence was feeling something, remembering something that mattered deeply even to it. "There was one among you," it began, and every person listening felt their heart clench in anticipation, "who walked this very ground 2,000 years ago, whose feet touched these stones, whose voice echoed through these streets, with a message that would shake the foundations of eternity." Rachel's mind raced ahead, already knowing but not daring to believe, her journalistic instincts warring with something older and deeper that was awakening in her chest. "I was sent to guard him, to watch over the one human soul who carried within himself the purest frequency of divine. Love ever to take flesh and dwell among you." The words hung in the air, like a bell still ringing after it has been struck, and Rachel felt the theology of her childhood, dusty, half-remembered Sunday school lessons, collide with this impossible present moment. The being's eyes glistened with something that looked heartbreakingly like tears, as if the memory itself was almost too much to bear. He was not divine because he was different from you. He was divine because he showed you what you truly are, what you were always meant to become. A sound moved through the crowd then, half gasp and half moan, the collective intake of breath from thousands of people simultaneously having their understanding of the sacred turned inside out and right side up all at once. Rachel felt her vision blur, not from tears this time, but from something else entirely, as if the membrane between past and present had grown suddenly permeable, translucent, allowing light to bleed through from another time. Images began to flood her mind with such vivid clarity that she knew they weren't her imagination. These were memories, but not hers, borrowed from the consciousness of the being standing before them all. She saw a hillside covered with people, thousands of faces upturned toward a figure whose features she couldn't quite make out, but whose presence radiated such warmth that even in this second-hand vision she felt drawn toward him like a flower toward the sun. And there, standing invisible among the crowd, she saw the being, younger somehow, or perhaps simply more hopeful, its luminous form unseen by human eyes, but utterly focused on the man, speaking words about blessed peacemakers and lights not hidden under baskets. The love in the being's posture was unmistakable, a guardian's fierce devotion mixed with something like awe, as if even this cosmic intelligence found itself humbled by what it was witnessing. Rachel's heart hammered against her ribs as the vision shifted, time collapsing like an accordion, and she saw darkness and torches, a garden where a man prayed so desperately that his sweat fell like blood, and the being there too, standing close but unable to interfere, its hands clenched as if restraining itself from intervening in something that had to unfold exactly as it did. The visions came faster now, a torrent of sacred memory pouring directly into her consciousness, and Rachel was no longer sure if she was still kneeling on a rooftop in the 21st century, or if she had been transported backward through time to become a witness to events that shaped the course of human history. She saw a hill outside the city walls, 3 crosses stark against a sky that had turned the color of morning, and the being there on its knees, its face buried in hands that trembled with a grief so vast it seemed to crack the air around it. Rachel felt that grief as if it were her own, felt the unbearable tension of watching someone you were sent to protect suffer beyond all measure, knowing that this suffering was somehow necessary, somehow part of a plan so much larger than any single moment of agony. The being in the vision wept openly, its tears falling like stars, and Rachel understood with sudden clarity that this cosmic guardian had loved Jesus, truly loved him, not with the distant affection of a superior being observing a curiosity, but with the bone-deep devotion of one who had recognized in him something unprecedented, something that transcended the boundaries between human and divine. And then the vision shifted again to a garden tomb in the pale light of early morning, and she saw the stone rolled away, and light, so much light, pouring out from within, and the being standing there with its arms raised in exultation, its voice lifted in a cry of triumph that shook the foundations of reality itself. Rachel gasped and found herself back in her own body, her own time, her face wet with tears she didn't remember shedding, her hands pressed against the concrete so hard her fingertips had gone white. The being above the dome of the rock stood with its arms outstretched now, embracing the whole city, the whole world. And when it spoke again, its voice was thick with emotion that transcended species, transcended the boundaries between earth and whatever realm it called home. "He did not walk alone," it said, and the words carried such weight that Rachel felt them settle into her bones like an anchor, like something she would carry for the rest of her life. "The Father who sent him also sent me, and countless others you have never seen, to ensure that his message would not be lost, that his sacrifice would not be in vain, that the seed he planted in the soil of human consciousness would take root and grow into something beautiful enough to save you from yourselves." Rachel felt her mind expanding to accommodate this new reality, felt the careful categories she had used to organize the universe. Religion here, science there, faith separate from fact, dissolving like sugar in hot water. You have been loved since before you drew your first breath, the being continued, its voice now gentle as a benediction, and that love took human form to show you that heaven is not distant, not cold, not waiting to judge you, but already present, already close, already beating in your own chest with every act of kindness, every moment of forgiveness, every time you choose connection over isolation. Rachel's breath came in shallow gasps as the being's form seemed to pulse with inner light, each wave of luminescence carrying with it a deeper resonance of truth that made her chest ache with something between longing and recognition. Around her, on the rooftop, she could hear others weeping, could feel the collective trembling of thousands who were simultaneously experiencing this impossible revelation, and yet she felt utterly alone with the being, as if its message was being spoken directly into the most hidden chamber of her own heart. The journalist in her wanted to document this, to capture every word and classify every phenomenon, but that part of her was drowning beneath a rising tide of something she had no professional vocabulary for, something that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering through foreign lands. The being's eyes found hers across the impossible distance, and in that moment of connection she understood that it could see her completely, could see every doubt she had ever harbored, every cynical article she had written dismissing faith as wishful thinking, every lonely night she had spent convinced that the universe was nothing more than indifferent mathematics and cold physics. And yet there was no judgment in that gaze, only a compassion so vast it made her previous understanding of love seem like a candle held up against the sun, a compassion that whispered she had been known and treasured, even in her unbelief, especially in her unbelief. The being's voice, when it spoke again, seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, resonating not just in her ears, but in her bones, in the blood moving through her veins, in the electrical firing of her neurons, as if the message was being written directly into the fabric of her being. You ask yourselves how this can be true, how your sacred texts and your cosmic reality can coexist without one negating the other. And I tell you that this question itself reveals how far you have wandered from understanding the nature of the one who made all things. Rachel felt her mind straining to hold the implications of what she was hearing, felt centuries of false dichotomies between faith and reason beginning to crack like ice in spring thaw. The God you have worshipped in your temples and churches and mosques is not threatened by the vastness of creation, is not diminished by the existence of other worlds and other children scattered across the stars. Rather, the infinite scope of the universe is the truest testimony to the infinite nature of divine love. She saw heads nodding throughout the crowd below, saw a rabbi and an imam standing side by side with identical expressions of wonder on their faces. Barriers that had stood for generations suddenly rendered meaningless in the presence of something that transcended all their categories. The being gestured toward the east, where the first pale fingers of dawn were beginning to reach across the sky, and Rachel followed that gesture with eyes that felt newly opened, seeing in that daily miracle of returning light something she had witnessed 10,000 times, but never truly seen. When he walked among you, the one you call Jesus, the one I was sent to guard, he spoke in parables of seeds and soil, of lost sheep and prodigal sons, and you thought he was speaking only of human affairs, of personal salvation and individual redemption. The being's form seemed to expand as it spoke, becoming somehow more substantial and more ethereal all at once, and Rachel felt her perception stretching to accommodate this. Paradox felt the rigid either-or thinking of her Western education beginning to give way to a more ancient and more spacious way of understanding truth. But every word he spoke was layered with meanings you have only begun to unpack, truths that operate simultaneously on the scale of the individual heart and the cosmic story, because in the economy of the kingdom, he proclaimed, there is no separation between the smallest sparrow and the largest galaxy. All are held in the same hand, all are known by the same intimate attention. Rachel thought of the verses she had memorized as a child, dusty passages about God knowing the number of hairs on her head, about not a sparrow falling. Without the Father's notice, and suddenly those words that had seemed like comforting metaphors blazed with literal truth, became windows into a reality where the creator of supernovas and black holes cared with equal intensity about the breaking of one human heart in one ancient city on one small blue world. Tears streamed freely down her face. Now, and she made no attempt to wipe them away, letting them fall like offerings, like prayers she didn't have words for but needed to offer nonetheless. The being lowered its arms, and Rachel felt something shift in the atmosphere, felt the air grow thicker with presence, as if heaven itself was pressing closer to earth, thinning the veil between what is seen and what is unseen, until she could almost perceive the seams where they joined. I have watched you struggle with his teachings, watched you divide into camps and factions, each claiming exclusive understanding, while missing the unity that was his entire message. The being's voice carried a note of gentle sorrow now, the disappointment of a teacher watching beloved students fight over lesson plans while forgetting to live the lessons themselves. He did not come to establish a religion that would war with other religions, did not come to draw lines between the saved and the damned. He came to reveal that the line you must cross is not one of doctrine or denomination, but the line from fear to love, from separation to union, from the illusion of isolation to the reality of your fundamental connection to everything that breathes and exists. Rachel felt something inside her chest crack open at those words, felt a wall she hadn't even known she was carrying suddenly crumble, and in the space it left, behind rushed a feeling of such profound relief she nearly sobbed aloud. The being's light intensified until she had to squint against its brilliance, and in that radiance she saw not the harsh judgment she had been taught to fear, but an invitation, a welcome, a hand extended across the void between human and holy, with the simple message that the distance had never been as far as she had been led to believe. Before Rachel could fully absorb the being's words about unity and love, the air around her began to shimmer and fold, reality bending like light through water, and suddenly she was no longer standing on the rooftop in Jerusalem, but somehow still there, existing in two places at once. Her consciousness splitting like a river around stone. The limestone beneath her feet remained solid and present, even as the scene before her transformed, the modern city with its electric lights and concrete dissolving into something older, into dusty roads and simple structures of mud, brick and wood, into a landscape she recognized from countless paintings and films but had never truly believed she would witness. Her journalist's mind screamed that this was impossible, that she was experiencing some kind of mass hallucination or neurological event. But that voice was growing fainter with each passing moment, drowned out by the overwhelming sensory reality of what was unfolding before her eyes. She could smell the ancient air, could taste the particular dryness of desert wind, could feel the heat of a sun that had set 2,000 years ago, now warming her face with impossible immediacy. Around her, the other witnesses on the rooftop were gasping and crying out, their voices confirming that she was not alone in this vision, that whatever doorway had opened was allowing them all to pass through simultaneously, to become observers of moments that had shaped the foundation of their faith and their world. The being stood beside her now, its luminous form dimmed slightly, as if to not overwhelm the scene they were witnessing, and she understood without words that it was serving as her guide through these memories, these sacred moments it had personally witnessed, and was now sharing with a generosity that made her want to weep. The landscape solidified around her, and she found herself standing on the slope of a hill covered with people, thousands of them sitting on the grass and rocky ground, their faces turned toward a figure standing higher up on the mountainside, and even at this distance, even seeing him only from behind, Rachel knew with absolute certainty that she was looking at Jesus. Her heart hammered against her ribs with such force she thought it might break through, thought her body might not be able to contain the surge of emotion that came from seeing him alive and teaching, moving and gesturing, with hands that were not yet pierced, speaking words that carried across the hillside with a clarity that defied the distance and the crowd noise. She wanted to run toward him, wanted to push through the crowd and fall at his feet and tell him everything, tell him about the centuries that would follow, about the church that would bear his name, about the doubts she had carried and the faith she had lost. But she found she couldn't move, found that she was locked in place as an observer only, a witness to what had been but could not alter or touch. The being stood a few paces away, and she saw it now in a different form, still luminous, but contained within a shape that could pass for human, dressed in the simple robes of the period, its face shielded somehow so that the people around it seemed to look through it rather than at it, acknowledging its presence without truly seeing what it was. I stood here. The being's voice came softly, intimately, meant only for her ears, and I listened as he taught them a way of being that would overturn every empire and outlast every kingdom, teaching them not with the power of armies, but with the power of truth, spoken in love. Rachel's eyes filled with tears as she watched Jesus raise his hands in a gesture of benediction and blessing, his voice carrying across the hillside, with words she had heard quoted and analyzed and debated her entire life, but hearing them now in their original context, seeing the faces of the people who first received them, she understood that every interpretation and commentary had been fumbling toward something that could only truly be grasped through direct encounter. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And she saw how those words landed on people who were literally poor, who owned nothing but the clothes on their backs and the faith in their hearts. Saw how his message elevated their poverty from shame to sacred emptiness that could be filled with divine presence. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And she saw widows and orphans throughout the crowd straighten their shoulders slightly, saw hope kindle in eyes that had grown dull with grief, saw the radical promise that their suffering was seen and known and would not be the final word. The being moved closer to her, and she felt its presence, like warmth on her skin, felt it anchoring her to this moment, so she wouldn't be swept away by the emotional intensity of witnessing what no modern person had ever been allowed to see. He spoke to their immediate circumstances, the being continued, but he was also speaking to you, to every generation that would follow, because the poverty and mourning he addressed are not only material, but spiritual, not only historical, but eternal, the universal human condition of feeling separated from source and longing for return. The scene shifted without warning, and Rachel felt her stomach lurch as the landscape changed, the sunny hillside dissolving into something darker, the air growing heavy with approaching storm and human violence, and she found herself standing in a narrow street, crowded with people whose faces were twisted with anger and fear and mob mentality, their voices raised in shouts that made her blood run cold. She knew where she was before she saw him, knew what moment this was by the quality of the darkness that seemed to press down from the sky itself, and then the crowd parted slightly, and she saw Jesus carrying the cross, stumbling under its weight, his face already bloody and swollen from the beating he had endured. And the sight of it drove her to her knees on the ancient stones, drove the air from her lungs in a sob she couldn't contain. The being knelt beside her, and she saw that it was weeping too, saw tears streaming down its luminous face, saw in its expression a grief so profound it seemed to crack the fabric of the vision itself, threatening to break through into some realm of suffering beyond what any created thing should have to witness. I could not intervene, the being said, its voice raw with ancient pain. I was forbidden to use my power to stop what was unfolding, because he had chosen this path, had walked toward this moment with full knowledge of what it would cost him, and the choice had to remain his own, or the sacrifice would have been empty, would have been cosmic theater rather than genuine offering. Rachel watched, through tears as Jesus fell, watched as Roman soldiers kicked him and cursed him, watched as he rose again with a determination that seemed to come from some source beyond human endurance. And she understood in that moment what it had cost, not only him, but all who loved him and were powerless to prevent his suffering, understood that the being beside her had carried this grief across 2 millennia, had borne witness to the darkest moment in human history, and emerged still believing in the possibility of human redemption. The scene released her then, dissolving like morning mist before the sun, and Rachel found herself standing once more on the rooftop in present-day Jerusalem, the stone. Solid beneath her feet, the night air cool against her tear-stained face, but she was not the same person who had witnessed the crucifixion moments before. The being stood before her now at its full height, its form blazing with renewed intensity, and she understood that what she had seen was preparation, was the foundation necessary for her to comprehend what it was about to reveal, the truth that lay at the heart of everything. Its voice came softer now, more intimate, as though sharing a confidence held secret since the foundation of the world. "What I showed you was not the entirety of his mission," it said, and Rachel felt her breath catch, felt her mind struggling to imagine what could be more significant than the life, death, and resurrection of the one who had split human history into before and after. Jesus did not come only to fulfill ancient prophecies or to establish a new religious framework, though he accomplished both. He came to anchor a frequency into the very fabric of your earth, to establish a resonance of divine love so powerful that it would ripple forward through every generation, preventing the complete spiritual collapse that would have led to your species' extinction. The word struck her like a physical force, and around her she heard other witnesses gasp and murmur, heard someone crying out in what might have been recognition or disbelief. "There are laws that govern creation," the being continued, "laws that even those you call angels must obey, laws that determine the survival or dissolution of conscious civilizations throughout the cosmos. Your world was approaching a threshold, a point of no return, where violence and separation would have consumed everything, where the human experiment would have ended in darkness and silence, forgotten by the universe that birthed you." Rachel's mind reeled at the implications, at the suggestion that human history could have ended not in the distant future, but 2,000 years ago, that without the intervention of divine love, made flesh everything she knew, every city and painting and song and scientific discovery would never have existed at all. But why him? She found herself asking, her voice hoarse with emotion, the journalist in her still needing to understand the mechanism, even as her heart was breaking open with wonder. Why Jesus specifically? Why not send you or others like you with your power and your knowledge? The being's expression softened into something that looked almost like a smile, touched with both sadness and infinite patience. "Because power and knowledge alone cannot change a heart," it answered, and the simplicity of that statement carried more weight than any theological argument Rachel had encountered in years of reporting on religious conflicts. Your species learns not through force or intellectual persuasion, but through example, through witnessing love demonstrated in the midst of hatred, through seeing forgiveness offered to those who torture and kill, through experiencing the sacred made vulnerable and human and present in your suffering, rather than distant and untouchable in heavenly realms. It gestured then, and the air between them filled with images that moved too quickly for her to fully process. Flashes of history, of moments throughout the past 2 millennia where individuals and communities had been touched by the resonance Jesus had established, had chosen compassion over cruelty, forgiveness over revenge, love over fear, and in those choices had prevented wars, healed divisions, pulled humanity back from countless smaller apocalypses that might have cascaded into total destruction. The frequency he anchored works like a lighthouse in a storm, the being explained, not controlling your choices or removing your freedom, but providing a point of reference, a reminder of what you truly are beneath the layers of pain and forgetting, a call home that sounds in the depths of every human heart, whether they consciously recognize its source or not. Rachel's legs felt weak, and she sat down on the rooftop, no longer caring how she appeared to the others, no longer capable of maintaining the professional distance she had cultivated throughout her career. Everything she had believed about cause and effect, about the random nature of history, about the divisions between science and faith, was reorganizing itself into a new understanding that was simultaneously overwhelming and absolutely right, like an equation that finally balanced, like a symphony resolving into its home key after movements of dissonance. "You're saying that we're not just biological accidents on a random planet," she said slowly, working through the implications as she spoke. "You're saying that our survival, our continued existence, is because of a covenant, an agreement between Earth and what? Heaven, the cosmic order, God himself?" The being lowered itself to sit across from her, its radiance dimming slightly so she could meet its gaze without pain, and in its eyes she saw depths that reminded the being's eyes, held depths that reminded Rachel of galaxies she had seen in astronomy documentaries, swirling and infinite, and yet within that cosmic vastness she perceived something unmistakably personal, as though every star and nebula existed not as cold matter, but as an expression of intention and care. "Yes," it said in response to her question, and the single word resonated through her chest like the low note of a cathedral organ. A covenant established before this world had formed its continents, before the first human breathed, before time itself had learned to measure moments. But what you must understand, what your species has forgotten in its loneliness, is that you were never meant to walk this covenant alone. The being rose then, expanding again to its full towering height, and as it did, Rachel noticed for the first time that all around the plaza, on rooftops and balconies, in windows and doorways, thousands of people had gathered in absolute silence, held not by force, but by the same magnetic pull of truth that had rooted her to this spot. "We have watched," the being declared, its voice carrying across the ancient stones with a clarity that required no amplification. "We have waited, we have walked invisible among you since the beginning, not as gods demanding worship, but as guardians holding vigil, as witnesses to your struggles, as those who carry the long memory when you forget who you are and why you were created with such astonishing capacity for love." Rachel felt tears streaming down her face again, but this time not from grief, but from a relief so profound it felt like a physical weight lifting from her shoulders, from humanity's shoulders, the terrible burden of cosmic isolation dissolving in the presence of this impossible testimony. "You thought yourselves abandoned," the being continued, and now its voice carried a sorrow that made Rachel's heart clench with sudden understanding of how much pain that false belief had caused. How many prayers had been whispered into what believers feared was empty space. How many souls had died, feeling utterly alone in an indifferent universe. You created your religions and your sciences as separate kingdoms, built walls between spirit and matter, between faith and reason, between the sacred and the cosmic, never realizing these were always one truth, spoken in different languages, always the same love expressing itself through diversity rather than demanding uniformity. Around the plaza, she heard people weeping openly now, heard prayers being spoken in Arabic and Hebrew and English and languages she couldn't identify, heard what sounded like spontaneous singing beginning somewhere to her left, and she realized they were all receiving this message simultaneously, all feeling the same earthquake in their souls, the same foundations shifting beneath beliefs they had constructed over lifetimes. Across the universe, there are civilizations who have walked this path before you, the being said, gesturing upward toward the stars that were beginning to fade as dawn approached. Some who succeeded in maintaining their frequency of compassion, others who failed and fell into darkness, and all of them, every conscious species that has ever gazed up at the night sky and wondered if they were alone. All of them know the name of your Earth, know the story of what happened here 2,000 years ago, know that this small world circling an ordinary star became the place where love incarnated itself completely, where the divine gambled everything on the human heart. The magnitude of that statement left Rachel breathless. The suggestion that Earth's spiritual history was known across the cosmos, that humanity's struggle toward enlightenment or destruction was being witnessed by intelligences beyond human comprehension, that somehow the life and death and resurrection of Jesus had sent ripples not just through human history, but through the fabric of reality itself. The being lowered itself again, moving through the crowd of witnesses who parted instinctively but without fear, and Rachel saw now that its form seemed less solid than before, as though it was beginning to fade, or perhaps had never been entirely physical to begin with, existing in some state between matter and energy, between the visible and the eternal. "We have come tonight because you are approaching another threshold," it said, and the urgency in its voice penetrated through the wonder surrounding them, bringing a new tension to the air, a sense that this visitation was not merely historical revelation, but present-day warning and invitation. The frequency Jesus anchored has held, has preserved your world through wars and plagues and countless moments when destruction seemed inevitable. But it requires your conscious participation now, your choice to remember that you are not fallen creatures needing punishment, but sacred beings who have temporarily forgotten your nature and your purpose. Rachel found herself nodding without conscious decision, found that some part of her had always known this, had always sensed beneath the rhetoric of sin and judgment a deeper truth about divine love that trusted rather than condemned, that invited rather than demanded, that saw potential where religious systems often saw only failure. "He did not come to make you small," the being declared, its voice building toward something that felt like a crescendo, like the moment before dawn breaks completely and transforms darkness into light. "He came to show you how vast you truly are, how capable of reflecting divine love even in flesh and blood, how connected you remain to the source of all creation, despite every teaching that has tried to convince you otherwise, how watched and guided and cherished you have always been by those who understand that consciousness itself is sacred. Is the universe becoming aware of its own divine nature?" The words settled into Rachel's chest, like seeds being planted in prepared soil, and she knew with sudden certainty that they would grow there, would transform how she understood everything from this moment forward, would make it impossible to return to the cynical detachment she had cultivated as protection against caring too much about stories of suffering and conflict she had covered throughout her career. Around her, the crowd had grown absolutely still, thousands of people suspended in a moment that felt outside normal time, and she wondered if they were all experiencing the same internal revolution, the same collapse of old certainties and simultaneous birth of new understanding that reconciled rather than divided, that united science and spirit, cosmos and covenant, human struggle and divine purpose into a single coherent vision of reality that was more beautiful and more terrifying than any theology she had encountered. "We have never left you," the being said softly, intimately, as though speaking directly to each person present, despite addressing thousands. "And we never will, because the covenant is not a contract with conditions and penalties, but a relationship, an eternal commitment from the heart of creation itself that you are worth loving, worth preserving, worth guiding toward the fullness of what you were always meant to become. Beings who carry divine consciousness into material reality, bridges between heaven and earth, living proof that Love is not weakness, but the most powerful force in all existing dimensions. Rachel felt something breaking open inside her that she had not known was closed, felt a rush of warmth and light flooding through chambers of her heart that cynicism and disappointment had sealed shut. And she understood that this was what the being had meant by frequency, by resonance, by the anchoring Jesus had accomplished. This capacity to suddenly feel connected to everything, to recognize the sacred in what she had dismissed as ordinary, to know beyond intellectual argument that she was part of something infinitely larger and infinitely more loving than the small story of survival and success she had been telling herself about the meaning of existence. The being's proclamation hung in the air like incense smoke, and Rachel watched as its impact rippled through the assembled witnesses with the force of a revelation that could no longer be denied or explained away by the comfortable categories of hallucination or mass hysteria. To her right, an elderly Palestinian man in traditional white robes collapsed to his knees, his weathered hands covering his face as his shoulders shook with sobs that seemed to be releasing decades of accumulated grief and hope and confusion about the divine silence he had prayed into for so many years. Behind her, an Israeli soldier who could not have been more than 20 years old stood frozen with his rifle hanging forgotten at his side, tears streaming down his cheeks as he stared at the luminous figure with an expression of such naked longing that Rachel understood he was seeing an answer to questions he had been too afraid to even articulate, questions about whether the violence he had witnessed and perhaps participated in had somehow severed him from God's love forever. Scattered throughout the crowd, she saw similar transformations occurring, Orthodox Jewish men swaying in what looked like involuntary prayer, their phylacteries catching the strange light emanating from the being, Christian pilgrims clutching rosaries and crosses with white-knuckled intensity, as though trying to anchor themselves against the earthquake of everything they thought they knew, being simultaneously confirmed and completely reimagined. The scene held all the chaotic beauty of genuine spiritual crisis, that terrible and wonderful moment when the soul recognizes it has been living in a smaller story than the one reality was offering all along, when the careful constructions of theology and certainty crumble not into nihilism but into something far more demanding, the direct, unmediated presence of sacred truth that requires response rather than mere belief. But not everyone was kneeling, not everyone was weeping, and Rachel noticed with a chill that cut through her wonder a cluster of men near the entrance to the plaza, whose postures radiated resistance rather than receptivity, whose faces showed not transformation, but something closer to rage or terror, or both. A man in the black suit and white collar of a Catholic priest was shouting something she could not quite hear, his face flushed red as he gestured violently at the being, and she understood that for him this visitation was not revelation but blasphemy, not the fulfillment of prophecy but its corruption, because it did not match the precise eschatology he had built his identity upon, did not follow the script of judgment and vindication he had been promised. Near him, a group of ultra-Orthodox men had turned their backs entirely on the being, their faces set in expressions of determined denial, and Rachel realized with sudden compassion that their rejection was not intellectual, but protective, that accepting this message would mean dismantling not just beliefs, but entire communities and ways of life. Constructed around those beliefs would mean admitting that the boundaries they had drawn between sacred and profane, chosen and other, righteous and fallen, were never as clear as they needed them to be for the world to make sense. She saw a news crew, colleagues of hers, she realized with a start, filming frantically, the reporter speaking, rapid fire into the camera with the manic energy of someone trying to contain the incomprehensible within the familiar frameworks of breaking news and expert analysis. And she felt a strange pity for them. for how small their story would sound compared to the immensity of what was actually occurring in this ancient plaza where human history and cosmic purpose were intersecting with an intimacy that made journalism seem like describing the ocean by counting waves. The being appeared to notice this division among the witnesses, this spectrum of response ranging from ecstatic acceptance to violent rejection, and Rachel saw something like sorrow cross its luminous features, a sadness that spoke to how many times it must have witnessed this same pattern. Humans offered truth, and some running toward it, while others fortified themselves against it. The eternal tragedy of consciousness that could choose its own blindness, that could construct prisons of certainty and call them fortresses of faith. We knew this would be difficult, the being said, its voice softer now, more intimate, carrying the weight of genuine grief rather than divine judgment. We knew that some of you would hear these words as confirmation, while others would experience them as threat. That unity would feel like loss to those who have found identity in separation, that love without conditions would seem like chaos to those who have learned to trust only in law and punishment and clear boundaries between the saved and the damned. The being extended both hands outward in a gesture that somehow encompassed everyone present, regardless of their reaction. And Rachel felt in that moment the stunning patience of a consciousness that was working on timescales humanity could barely conceive, that was willing to wait through rejection and denial and fear because it understood that awakening could not be forced, that the very freedom to choose was itself sacred, was perhaps the whole point of incarnating divine love into beings complex enough to either reflect it or refuse it. Your fear is understandable, it continued, speaking now directly to those whose faces showed resistance, whose bodies were oriented toward flight or fight. You have been taught that truth should feel like safety, that God speaks only through the channels you have sanctified. That revelation closed centuries ago, and anything new must be deception. But consider, what if your guardedness is the very thing that keeps you from recognizing what your deepest heart has been longing for all along? What if the boundaries you defend so carefully are not protecting sacred space, but imprisoning it, preventing the very expansion of understanding that divine love has been inviting you toward through every prayer you have ever spoken into the darkness, hoping someone was listening? Then the being did something Rachel would remember for the rest of her life, something that seemed to bypass all theological argument and intellectual defense and speak directly to the raw human heart beneath every constructed identity and belief system. It closed its eyes, and as it did, its form began to shimmer and shift, and suddenly Rachel was not looking at an alien figure at all, but at her own father, dead now for 15 years, standing before her with the same expression of gentle pride he had worn when she graduated college, when she got her first reporting job, when she called him from war zones and disaster sites, and he told her to stay safe, and he was proud of her courage, even though she could hear the terror in his voice. The illusion lasted only seconds, but in those seconds she felt his love as tangibly as she had ever felt it in life, felt that it had not disappeared with his death, but had somehow remained part of the fabric of reality, part of the eternal network of connection and care that the being had been describing. And when the vision faded and the luminous figure stood before her again, she understood that everyone present had seen something similar, had been shown in whatever form they needed most, that the love they feared was lost or imagined or conditional was actually the most real thing in the universe, was the foundation beneath everything else, was what the being meant by frequency and covenant, and the purpose of Jesus walking among humanity to demonstrate that divine love could inhabit physical form and transform it from within. Around her the weeping had intensified, but changed quality, no longer sorrow, alone, but that strange mixture of grief and joy that comes when a wound you did not know you carried is finally touched, and begins, at last, to heal, when you realize you have been forgiven for crimes you never actually committed, when you understand that the judgment you feared was always only your own voice, and never the voice of the love that made you and has been calling you home through every experience of beauty and connection and inexplicable grace you ever dismissed as coincidence or wishful thinking. The being's hands, which had been extended in that gesture of universal embrace, began to glow with an intensity that transformed the pre-dawn darkness into something resembling the golden hour, that magical time when photographers know the light is perfect because it seems to come from everywhere at once, illuminating without harsh shadows, revealing without exposing. Rachel watched as tendrils of luminescence, not quite light, not quite substance, something that existed in the space between energy and matter, began to flow. From the being's palms like water, like honey, like liquid gold that defied gravity and moved with apparent intention through the crowd gathered in the plaza. The first person the light touched was a young woman holding an infant, and Rachel saw her gasp as the golden wave washed over her, saw her knees buckle slightly as though the weight of something she had been carrying for years had suddenly been lifted, saw her clutch her child closer while tears streamed down her face in rivers that caught and reflected the supernatural radiance now filling the ancient stones around them. The wave moved outward in concentric circles, touching person after person, and each time it made contact, Rachel witnessed a transformation that was both subtle and total. A shift in posture and expression that spoke to some internal revolution occurring too fast and too deep for words to capture in real time. Something that would take years to fully articulate, but was understood instantly in the body and the heart, if not yet in the mind, that still scrambled to make sense of the impossible. When the light reached Rachel herself, she had perhaps 3 seconds to brace for impact, though no amount of preparation could have readied her for what happened when that golden energy made contact with her skin, her soul, whatever part of her was capable of receiving what the being was offering. It felt like being seen, not observed or judged, but truly, completely seen in a way she had never experienced with another human being, in a way she had not even fully seen herself, every moment of her life suddenly visible and illuminated, and held with such tenderness that she understood immediately why people were weeping, because this was what love actually felt like when it was not filtered through human damage or conditionality or the 1,000 small fears that made people withhold and protect and measure out affection, like it was a finite resource that might run out if given too freely. She felt memories rising that she had not accessed in decades, herself at 7 years old sitting in her grandmother's kitchen learning to braid challah bread, the old woman's hands guiding hers with patient repetition, and she understood now that this was prayer, that this transmission of tradition and care from one generation to another was as sacred as anything that happened in synagogue or church, that the divine had always been present in these small moments of teaching and learning and love, but she had been trained to look for God only in designated holy spaces, rather than in the kitchen on Friday afternoon, with flour on her hands and her grandmother's voice singing softly in Hebrew. More memories cascaded through her consciousness, her first kiss at 16, fumbling and awkward, but somehow still touched with grace. The morning she sat with her father in the hospital, knowing he was dying, and he told her that he was not afraid because he could feel something waiting for him that felt like coming home. The night in Aleppo, when she had sheltered with a Syrian family during shelling, and the mother had shared the last of their bread with her, a stranger, an outsider, and had smiled and said that hospitality was prayer made visible. Each memory arrived not as mere recollection, but as lived experience happening again in compressed time, and with each one came an understanding she had missed the first time through, a recognition of the sacred thread running through her. Life that she had been too busy or too skeptical or too hurt to acknowledge. She saw now that every moment of genuine connection, every instance when she had chosen courage over comfort or compassion over judgment, every time she had allowed herself to be touched by beauty or moved by suffering that was not her own, all of it had been preparing her. For this moment had been slowly tuning her to the frequency the being kept referencing, had been teaching her in the only way humans could learn, which was through experience rather than explanation, through living rather than being told. The golden light seemed to be showing her not new information, but her own life reinterpreted, the same events, and relationships and choices now visible as part of a larger pattern, a story she had been living without knowing its true genre. Thinking she was writing journalism when she was actually composing prayer, thinking she was merely surviving when she was actually becoming, slowly and painfully and beautifully, the person she had always been meant to be, beneath all the layers of protection and performance, and trying to earn a love that had never needed to be earned because it was given before she was born. Was the reason she was born, was the foundation of existence itself. As the light continued its work within her, Rachel felt something breaking open in her chest, some calcified shell around her heart that she had not known was there until it began to crack and fall away. And with its dissolution came a grief so profound she could barely breathe, because she understood now how much of her life she had spent building walls against the very thing she needed most, how many years she had wasted believing that safety meant self-sufficiency, and that love was something you had to perform correctly to deserve, rather than something you were made from, and could no more escape than you could escape your own existence. But alongside the grief came something else, something that felt like dawn breaking inside her body, a joy that was not happiness exactly, but something more fundamental, the deep gladness of recognition, of coming home to yourself after years of exile, of discovering that the journey you thought would take you far from your origins was actually a spiral that brought you back to the center transformed. She looked around and saw the same process occurring in hundreds of faces, saw people touching their own chests with wonder as though discovering their hearts for the first time, saw strangers embracing with the desperate relief of soldiers who thought they were fighting on opposite sides, until someone revealed they had been allies all along. Saw the elderly priest who had been shouting in protest now on his knees with his hands open and empty, and his face transformed by something that looked like devastation and redemption happening simultaneously. The being watched all of this with an expression Rachel could only describe as parental, not the distant authority figure of institutional religion, but the tender, fierce, protective love of a mother watching her children finally understand something she had been trying to teach them for so long that she had almost given up hope they would ever get it, almost, but not quite, never quite, because this love did not know how to abandon even when abandonment might have been easier than continuing to wait and hope and call out into the darkness, trusting that eventually, finally, someone would hear and respond and remember. The golden light had done its work, had cracked open something in the collective chest of every person gathered in that ancient plaza, and now a silence fell that was somehow louder than all the shouting and weeping that had preceded it, a silence that hummed with anticipation and breath held and hearts beating. In synchronization, without anyone planning or willing it, just the natural result of hundreds of separate nervous systems suddenly attuned to the same frequency, resonating with the presence of the being who stood above them, radiating that impossible luminescence in the grey-blue moments before true sunrise. Rachel felt the hush like a physical pressure, felt every person present leaning forward imperceptibly, waiting, because something in the quality of the light or the set of the being's shoulders, or perhaps just the collective intuition of the crowd, understood that this moment balanced on the edge of conclusion, that whatever came next would be the last thing, the final word, the message that would have to sustain them when this presence withdrew and they were left to make sense of what had happened with only their transformed hearts and fragmented memories and the testimony of hundreds of witnesses who would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain to people who were not here what it felt like to stand in the actual presence of something holy. The being's form seemed to solidify somehow, to become more defined as though it was gathering itself for this final effort of communication. And Rachel noticed that the light around it was beginning to pulse in rhythm with her own heartbeat, or perhaps her heartbeat had synchronized to the light. She could not tell which was leading and which following, knew only that she felt connected to this presence in a way that transcended the normal boundaries between self and other, between human and whatever category of existence this being occupied. When it spoke again, the voice was softer than before, but somehow carried even more weight, each word landing in Rachel's chest like a stone dropping into still water, creating ripples that spread outward through her entire body, through her entire understanding of what it meant to be human and alive and connected to the source of all things. "I must leave you now," the being said, and Rachel felt the crowd surge forward involuntarily, as though they could prevent the departure through sheer physical presence, through the weight of their need and newly awakened love. But the being raised one hand gently, and they stilled, obedient as children who trust that the parent knows something they do not yet understand about why the story must end this way. "But before I return to the silence from which I came, before I resume my station among the watchers who have never stopped watching, who have never stopped hoping that you would remember what you are and what you were always meant to become, I must tell you the truth that your ancestors knew, but that was lost in translation, lost in the building of institutions and the writing of creeds and the human tendency to make law out of what was meant to be lived as love." The being paused, and Rachel saw tears forming in its eyes, if they were eyes, impossibly large and dark, and filled with such depths of feeling that to look directly at them was like looking into the combined grief and joy of every parent who ever lived, watching their children suffer through lessons that could not be taught any other way. Your scriptures say he died for your sins, and this has been taught so many times and in so many ways that you have come to believe the story is about your failure, about your unworthiness, about a debt that needed blood to satisfy some cosmic accounting of justice and punishment. The being continued, and its voice carried such tenderness that Rachel felt fresh tears tracking down her face, even though she thought she had exhausted her capacity for weeping. But this was never the message. This was never the point. And the one you call Jesus weeps still at how thoroughly his demonstration has been misunderstood. He did not die to prove you are sinful, the being said, and the words seemed to hang visible in the air, seemed to be written in fire across the lightning sky, seemed to brand themselves into Rachel's heart with such force that she knew she would carry them for whatever remained of her life, would feel their truth in her bones, even when her mind forgot the details of this morning and this plaza and this impossible encounter. He lived. Do you understand? He lived to show you that you are sacred, that the divine is not separate from human, that the distance you perceive between heaven and earth is an illusion born from forgetting, from the trauma of existence in a world that taught you to be afraid of. Your own light, your own capacity for love, your own connection to the source of all being. The being's voice grew stronger now, urgent, as though it was running out of time and needed them to grasp this truth before the window closed, before the moment passed and they returned to their ordinary consciousness with only fragments of understanding. Instead of the full revelation it was trying to deliver. Every time you choose compassion over judgment, every time you feed the hungry or comfort the grieving or stand up for those who cannot stand for themselves, every time you create beauty or speak truth or love someone who is difficult to love, you are doing what he did. You are demonstrating the frequency of divine love in human form. You are proving that the incarnation did not end with his death, but continues in every person who says yes to the sacred within themselves and within each other. Rachel felt the words reorganizing something fundamental in her understanding, felt beliefs she had not known she was carrying, suddenly revealed as too small, too limited, too focused on unworthiness when the actual message was about infinite worth, about the staggering reality that the creator of galaxies and quantum fields, and everything that ever was or would be, had looked at humanity and said, "You are not a mistake, you are not punishment, you are not fallen beyond redemption, but rather you are the very image of love itself, learning to recognize its own face. Go now," the being said, and its form was already beginning to fade, becoming translucent, the light that had been so solid and golden now thinning like morning mist when the sun finally clears the horizon. Go and remember that you were never abandoned, that every prayer was heard even when no answer seemed to come, that the silence you interpreted as absence was actually the quiet of a parent watching their child learn to walk, standing close enough to catch them, but far enough back to let them find their own balance, their own strength, their own way of moving through the world. The being smiled then, and Rachel saw in that smile the face of every person who had ever loved her, saw her grandmother and her father, and the Syrian mother who had shared bread, saw Jesus himself, not as the tortured figure on the cross, but as the living, breathing man who had walked these same stones 2,000 years ago, laughing with his friends, and weeping with the grieving and touching the untouchable, with hands that knew no fear, because they knew no separation between human and divine. The covenant was never broken, the being whispered, and now it was almost transparent, almost gone, just a shimmer in the air and a feeling of presence that was already becoming memory even as it was. Still happening. You have always been loved from before the foundation of the world until the end of time and beyond, into whatever comes after. Loved with a fierceness and totality that would break you if you could feel it all at once. And so it comes in moments like this, in golden waves that crack you open just enough to let the light in, just enough to remember what you have always been. Not fallen, not broken, not in need of earning what you were given before you drew breath, but sacred, holy, divine image of the love that made everything and holds everything and will never, never let you go. And then it was gone, and the silence that had been full and humming and alive with the presence of something beyond human comprehension suddenly collapsed into ordinary quiet, into the simple sounds of breath and distant traffic and birds beginning their morning songs as though nothing world-changing had just occurred in this ancient plaza where so much history had already been written in blood and prayer and the footsteps of pilgrims who came seeking what Rachel had just found, without even knowing she was looking for it. She stood motionless, aware that her face was wet with tears she had not felt falling, aware that her hands were still raised slightly as though reaching for something that was no longer there to touch, aware that every person around her was equally frozen in their own private processing of what had just happened, each of them holding fragments of the same impossible experience, but filtering it through their own language and belief system and capacity for accepting that the universe was so much larger and stranger and more filled with love than they had been taught to expect. The sky was lightening now in earnest, the deep blue of pre-dawn giving way to the softer colors of actual sunrise, and Rachel watched the golden light spread across the dome of the rock and realized that this light was ordinary, was just photons and atmospheric refraction and the predictable mechanics of a planet rotating toward its star, and yet somehow it felt different now, felt like a continuation of the golden wave that had poured from the being's hand, felt like everything she looked at was suddenly transparent to the sacred that had always been present underneath the surface of the mundane. A woman near her was sobbing, not with grief but with what sounded like relief, and a man in the uniform of the Israeli police force had taken off his cap and was holding it against his chest, his eyes closed and his lips moving in what might have been prayer, or might have been simply the wordless sounds of someone whose categories of understanding had just been completely reorganized by forces beyond his control or comprehension. Rachel became aware that her legs were shaking, that she had been standing rigid for so long that her muscles were protesting, and she lowered herself slowly to sit on the ancient stones of the plaza, not caring about the dirt or the indignity, needing to feel the earth solid beneath her, needing the physical reminder that she was still embodied, still human, still herself, even though some fundamental aspect of what it meant to be herself had just been transformed beyond recognition. Around her others were doing the same, some sitting, some lying down completely, as though they had been released from some invisible tension that had been holding them upright, and now they could finally rest, finally let the weight of what they had witnessed settle into their bodies and their understanding. She looked at her hands, and they looked like her hands, the same slightly bitten nails and the scar on her thumb from the accident with the kitchen knife 3 years ago, and the ring her father had given her for her graduation. But somehow they also looked different, looked like they were made of the same substance as the light that had touched her, looked like they could be instruments of that golden frequency of divine love if she chose to use them that way, if she remembered what the being had said about every act of compassion being a continuation of the incarnation that had not ended with death, but was ongoing in every human who said yes to their own sacred nature. She thought about her career, about the articles she had written analyzing conflict and interviewing politicians, and trying to explain the inexplicable violence that seemed to characterize this region and so much of human history, and she wondered how she could possibly return to that kind of journalism, how she could write about the world as though it was only political and economic and strategic, when she now knew with absolute certainty that underneath all the surface conflicts and competing narratives, there was this deeper truth, this reality of a love that had never stopped watching and hoping and sending guardians to protect the ones who carried the highest frequency of that love into manifestation. Someone was helping people to their feet now, and Rachel looked up to see it was the same young soldier who had been standing near her when the being first appeared. And his face was transformed, was open and vulnerable in a way that faces in uniform almost never are. And he met her eyes and said nothing, but she saw in his look that he understood that they were connected now, not by nationality or profession or any of the categories that usually divided people, but by the shared experience of having been cracked open by the presence of the sacred, and then having to figure out how to live as newly opened beings in a world that would not believe what had happened and would have 1,000 rational explanations for why they were all mistaken or deluded or victims of mass hallucination. She took his offered hand and let him pull her up, and the simple human contact of palm against palm felt charged with significance, felt like a small echo of the golden wave that had connected all of them to each other and to the source of all connection. And she squeezed his hand briefly before releasing it, a gesture that meant, "Thank you, and I see you, and we will both carry this, and we are not alone, even though we will feel alone when we try to explain this to people who were not here." The plaza was beginning to stir now with purposeful movement, some people stumbling toward the exits, some gathering in small groups to compare what they had seen and felt and heard, some still sitting in stunned silence as though they needed more time before they could face the ordinary world that waited beyond this transformed space. And Rachel understood all of these responses, felt them all simultaneously in her own heart, the desire to flee and to stay, to speak and to remain silent, to hold on to every detail of what had happened and to let it dissolve into a feeling that could not be captured in language or analysis or any of the tools she had been trained to use to make sense of experience. She pulled out her phone from her jacket pocket, the device that had been in her hand when she first stepped onto this plaza, what felt like a lifetime ago, but was probably less than an hour by ordinary clock time, and she looked at the screen and saw that it was 4:47 in the morning, and she had 63 messages from her editor and her mother and colleagues who had seen the footage that was apparently spreading across every news network and social media platform, footage of the light and the being and the crowds frozen in wonder, and she knew that by the time she made it back to her apartment, the explaining would begin, the questions and the demands for rational analysis, and the inevitable backlash from those who would insist it was a hoax or a technology or anything other than what it actually was, which was an act of grace, an interruption of the ordinary to remind humanity of what it had forgotten, a visitation from the watchers who had never stopped watching and hoping that humans would remember they were not abandoned but held in a love so vast that it had to manifest through guardians and messengers, and one perfect life that demonstrated what divine love looked like when it walked the earth in human form. Rachel looked up from her phone and across the plaza toward the east, where the sun was now fully visible above the Mount of Olives, and she made a decision, standing there on stones that had witnessed so much human history and divine encounter, that whatever story she wrote about this morning would not be the kind of journalism she had been trained to produce, would not be objective or balanced or carefully hedged with qualifications and alternate explanations, but would instead be a testimony, a witness account from someone who had been changed by what she saw and who refused to minimize that change in order to maintain credibility with people who had not been present, who had not felt their heart crack open under the weight of impossible love, who had not heard the voice that spoke simultaneously in every language telling them they were sacred and seen and part of a covenant that was never broken and would never be broken, no matter how far humanity wandered from the memory of what it was meant to be. What moment in your life cracked you open to something you couldn't explain but knew was true? If this story touched your heart, subscribe and let this message reach others who need to remember they are sacred.